Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a fascinating conference, the Real Estate Forum in downtown Toronto, and Stephen Paynter, a principal architect at Gensler, a big architectural firm in Toronto and around the world, presented on a panel with several other people about the future of downtowns and what made downtowns special. And I think they talked about architecture, they talked about urban affairs, et cetera. And so I wanted to check in and find out, what Stephen and others had to say. So please welcome to our show, Stephen Paynter. How are you, sir?
Very good. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. So this was really quite an interesting discussion at the forum. Tell me a little bit about, what your point of view was.
Well, it's interesting because we've really been focusing on how to get people back into the downtowns post-COVID, but it's an acceleration of a trend that's been going on for many years. We've seen gradually offices and residences sprawling, especially around Toronto and Mississauga. And that's been causing struggles for downtown businesses. So a big part of the conference a couple of weeks ago was how do we make downtowns exciting again? How do we bring people back? How do we add a mix of use to our city centres? And as we do that, can we help solve the other problems, commuting, crime, vacant retail storefronts, and that kind of thing?
So how do you make downtowns exciting again?
Well, I think the big thing for us is getting people there. We know from what's happening in cities like Calgary and other towns around Canada that have seen a population shrinking in their cores, that people are key. When you have people, you'll get all of the other things that people like. You have that population, then restaurants start to open, grocery stores start to open, retail, bars, all those kind of things that make cities exciting. But they all rely on you having a population that is there 24/7 and that's large enough to support that other infrastructure.
So in Toronto, you've got a huge amount of condos that have been developed downtown, and those people stayed. Downtown. It was the office workers that departed, and I understand haven't really come back. I understand from Metrolinx's statistics that the average daily commutes are down fairly dramatically. They're up sort of in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but still down Monday, Friday. But weekends are up. So people are going downtown on the weekends more than they did before, but they're not every day a week. And you can't justify the economics of the transit unless we start getting daily ridership up. So what does that tell you?
Well, there's some interesting issues we're seeing. And if you actually look at cell phone data for a number of people in different locations, and you look at leasing data, which offices are getting new tenants and which ones aren't, you'll find that there's pockets that are doing really well. And the downtown core in Toronto, where the Class A buildings are, is busy. I work down there every day. You have to line up to get lunch. You have to, transit is packed. The subway stations are packed. But that doesn't happen as you start to go out into the less desirable neighborhoods. And the really interesting information coming out of places like Manhattan, which are a bit further ahead, obviously, than what's happening in Toronto, you'll see that offices that are near primary transit, so right on Grand Central Station, Penn Station, they're really busy. Offices that are Class A, that people feel inspired to go to, that have a lot of amenities, they're really busy. And in a lot of cases, they're busier than they were pre-pandemic. However, the Class C offices, the ones that are away from transit, that are slightly more awkward to get to, they don't what we call earn the commute. People aren't excited to go to them. It's awkward to get to them, so they're just not. And they're voting with their feet, as people say. Even if they're being told to go back to work, they're deciding that they'd rather stay at home. So it's those ones that we really need to fix.
How do you fix them?
Well, there's a few things. I think actually a lot of the buildings that we've been utilizing for the last 10, 15 years are actually way out of date. We're working on some projects right now where the building hasn't been updated since the early 80s. And they were full because our office market was really strong. That isn't the case anymore. So I think a lot of those buildings really need to be overhauled. They need some really good sustainability and amenity upgrades. And we're seeing that start to happen. And some of them are end of life, and we need to figure out a new use for them. So we've been actually actively working with cities in Canada and around the world to try and figure out how we take some of those office buildings that aren't successful, that are really at the end of their life, as we call it, and turn them into other uses, residential, medical, things that are going to have people in them.
I noticed
maintain the buildings.
I noticed 4 days ago you actually posted an article about can offices become residential housing?
Yeah, and that's something we started with the city of Calgary back in early 2020. They had around 40% vacancy in their downtown, which is huge. It means that almost all of those buildings down there are losing money, losing population. So we looked at a study of how many of those could be converted and what would happen to the market if you say took 3 million square feet of office out, or if you took 6 million square feet of office out. And that led them to an incentive program where they're actually going to pay developers or pay landowners to convert buildings at a rate of about $75 a square foot, and using that to encourage a tax base back. So they're actually looking at it as an investment. They'll put the money in to help make these projects make sense. And then when people start living downtown, they'll see the tax base come back and it'll pay for itself pretty quickly, actually.
Yep, makes sense. So, you think about Toronto, your Class C office spaces or the less desirable spaces, are they in, the more suburban or the old, York and Etobicoke and North York areas of Toronto, or are they farther afield than that?
It's a real mix, actually. There are some sprinkled around downtown. Generally as buildings and cities get developed, you'll see, some really high quality buildings, some less so. But there are clusters of them, and areas that we're working at the moment, Yonge and Sheppard, Yonge and St. Clair, Yonge and Eglinton, obviously a lot happening there, but there's a lot of those buildings. So they tend to be concentrated around kind of secondary nodes, or normally around transit, but around outside of the core. And then we're also seeing that in the suburban market as well. But the suburban market's actually a lot more challenging. A lot of those Class C office buildings have much bigger floor plates. They're not well amenitized. People can't, go out for drinks or whatever after work. And they're not in amenity-rich environments that people want to be in. So even converting those to residential starts to become difficult. The floor plates don't lay out nicely, and people aren't, don't particularly want to live there. So those ones are the ones that we're really going to be focusing on over the next year or two to figure out a solution. Can we add density around them? Can we create pockets of mixed-use environment that people are going to really enjoy?
I think it's critical because, a couple of years ago, maybe before COVID, Metrolinx did a big study and said that too many of the commuters and the rail network, the office concentration was focused on downtown Toronto, and that wasn't sustainable in the long term, and that we had to create these transit nodes, I think they called them, in other environments, and turn our transit system, which I think was something like 97% of all of the people riding on GO Transit went to or from Union Station, and it had to change such that people dispersed and went into some other centers. But then it seems like while that made sense, we haven't done it, and we haven't been able to create those centers other than downtown.
No, they've been working on this program which they call reverse commuting. So obviously, if you imagine what happens at the moment, people get on a train, in Mississauga or other cities around, they come into Toronto, and then that train goes back empty and picks up the next lot of people. So half the time the trains are completely empty, which is obviously not very efficient and not very practical. So what they're looking to do is bring a full train into the city, and then as it leaves the city, it picks up people going in the opposite direction and disperses them out to secondary nodes as well. The issue we've always had around that is trying to develop high quality, high density developments right on those transit nodes, those secondary transit nodes outside of the city. That process has been very slow for a number of reasons, city approvals being a big one of them, and people not being keen on spreading density outside of the city as well. But we are starting to see those projects start, and there's some really good ones. Actually, as you kind of go along the water, east and west out of Toronto, they are starting to pick up good, tall, high density developments. And those developments have a really interesting mix of use as well. You're seeing, mixture of office, residential, restaurants, and that kind of thing. We need more of it though, and we also need to figure out what to do with the existing kind of office nodes or office parks that aren't on transit. How do you get people from the GO station, 5 miles, not very far, but how do you get them out to those office parks?
Sounds like a big challenge. We're going to take a break. and come back with Stephen Paynter in just 2 minutes. A principal at Gensler, a big architecture firm in downtown Toronto, who was on a panel with numerous other people just a couple of weeks ago at the Real Estate Forum, talking about how do we bring people back to the city, and are the cities still the vibrant places in the future that they have been in the past. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. If you've been following my show, you know that I'm really quite interested in development in cities, city planning, urban planning, etc. And I've got a real expert on my show tonight for you. Stephen Paynter is a principal at Gensler. Gensler is an architectural firm in Toronto, but also around the world. And Stephen's got really quite a impressive background. He's got a Bachelor of Architecture from Newcastle University. He's got a professional diploma in architecture from, I can't even pronounce this, Northumbria University, and
is it Northumbria? Yeah,
Northumbria, and then advanced diploma in the professional practice of architecture from the University of Liverpool. So obviously, we're gonna have to chat a little bit about why you moved out of Great Britain and came to Canada, and that'll be an interesting conversation. And then he's had quite a fascinating career, and I'm going to come back and ask you a little bit about this. You've worked for several years at Quadrangle Architects, and then for 8 years at Gensler. And one of your jobs at Gensler was the resilience and sustainability leader. So I'm going to want to ask you a little bit about how we build resilience and sustainability. That'll be interesting. For the last 3 years, you've been a principal here in Toronto with Gensler, and I love it. You call it a studio. Why do you call it a studio rather than an office?
It's interesting, actually, the way Gensler's set up. We're 7,000 people around the world. We're the world's largest architecture and interiors company. But if you imagine coming into work into a company that big, and you're trying to do great design work, and you're trying to engage your clients, and you're one of 7,000 people, it's very easy for you and your clients to feel lost. So what we actually do is break our teams down into offices, obviously, in different locations, and we hire local people in those locations to do the work. But then we break it into studios. So my studio is about 30 people, and we act as a small team. We have our own clients. We have our own business, effectively. And that keeps us agile. It keeps the team engaged, and it allows us to dedicate time and people to our clients without them feeling like they're lost in a huge spiraling company. So a studio at Gensler is normally around 30 people, really dedicated to one type of work and a handful of clients to do that, and to do that very locally as well. People who understand the neighborhoods they're working in.
A couple of decades ago, I think it was Tom Friedman wrote a book called "The World is Flat," and he argued that because of global communications and transportation and things like this, we could work from anywhere in the world. And Richard Florida, who was on your panel with you a couple of weeks ago at this real estate forum, wrote a response called "The World is Spiky," and argued that no, Friedman was wrong. The world isn't flat; it's very spiky, and that the vast majority of economic activity occurred in just a few cities around the world, and that it was dependent on the mass of people and the circulation between those people and the connections, etc., that led to success. COVID sort of made Friedman's argument valid, that people moved out of the cities and spread out and telecommuted, etc. What do you think? Is the world flat, or is it spiky?
I honestly think I'd have to agree with my fellow panelists from the other week. It's definitely spiky, and what COVID really did was move those spikes. The work we've been doing is so neighborhood specific. It's so linked to what that neighborhood has, what it needs, and how we can improve that. But if you take our downtown during COVID, people moved out. Sure, it really suffered. The neighborhood where I live in Roncesvalles on the West End became busier than it's ever been. We had new stores opening, we had new restaurants opening, and that was because the population had moved from spending 50 hours a week in the city to all of their time out in the neighborhood. So it just moved those spikes. I don't think it really flattened things out. It just moved it to where people were living rather than where they were working. And we see that across major cities as well. You need that kind of critical mass. You need a density of activity to create interest. There's a really interesting stat about, if you do one tower on a city block, you get 1,000 people living there, that will support one restaurant. Well, if you start to spread everyone out, suddenly you don't have the ability to support any restaurants. And that's just an example, or a small example, but we actually need those spikes. We need those places that people feel like they have a connection, and where commerce and culture can actually really exist with the people around it to make it successful.
I interviewed a developer who told me, and I'm not sure this statistic is correct or not, but he said that 80% of the condos that have been built in the last couple of years in Toronto had been built within a half a mile of a transit stop, either a GO or a subway stop, or maybe a streetcar, I'm not sure. Which he said proved that the vast majority of people that wanted to live in condos wanted to live close to transit, because even if they didn't take it every day, they wanted to be able to take it on a fairly frequent basis. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing that not just because for the ease of commuting and the fact that car ownership is reducing, but also car ownership in the city is really expensive. The cost of adding a parking space to a condo is, for the developer, around $200,000 to build it. They can't sell it for that much, so every parking space they build loses them money, but it also ups the price of the condos. So a lot of people are choosing to live on transit without parking to pay less for their real estate, less rent, less money for the condo. And then they get that flexibility, jump on the subway and go anywhere you want, or on the streetcar. So those transit located and transit focused developments are doing much better. And especially post-COVID as well, people want to be able to get around, but traffic has been worse. So transit has become the key focus for them.
Other than just density, what do you do to make a city vibrant? As an architect, when you're thinking about some of the developments, whether they be office or residential, what are some of the things that you think add to what do you call it, a sense of place, a place that people want to live or work?
Yeah, I have there's some really strong opinions on it. So I'll start with prefacing it. We've seen a lot of condos developed and a lot of office buildings developed recently that call themselves a vertical neighborhood or a vertical community, and they talk about amenities up off the floor and all these things. To me, that's really a disturbing trend. What we need to make our cities vibrant and engaging is that community to be on the ground. We need it to be walkable. We need it to be engaging. We need people who don't live in that building to be able to engage with the community or the neighborhood that's there. So as we start to develop these projects, or even taking parts of the city that are already developed but underused, it's really what you do with that ground floor, even with the sidewalk and other areas, that is critical. We're actually doing a project right now up at Yonge and St. Clair where the big move, honestly, is to widen the sidewalk and create public space so that people can walk on that side of the street. It's been too narrow and too awkward. So we're giving them the ability to walk on that side of the street. We're adding retail into the ground floor, and then you start to see that engagement. On a similar project actually across the street, we just added street furniture. We added doors to retail on the street rather than inside the mall. And that made a huge difference. Now you go up there and it used to be a kind of dead corner. Now there's people sat there. There's people eating their lunch outside there as well. So it can be some simple moves, but it is about that ground plane. It's about that, the bottom 20 feet of every building has to engage the community.
And it's retail, or it's street furniture, or public places, or all of the above?
All of the above, daycares, restaurants, coffee shops, retail, anything that is for people. And then as we do that, we're also trying to rationalize the things that aren't for people, servicing, loading, parking entrances, and move them out of the way. Get them around to the back of buildings, off of the laneways, and so they're not interrupting that kind of flow on the ground floor. So it's a combination, put the stuff there that people really want and try and move the other stuff away.
The size of sidewalks is kind of an interesting topic. At one point in time, they seemed to be really close. And then, when was it? The 60s, they moved way back, and there were these big grassy knolls between the sidewalk and the buildings. And now they're moving closer again, but not as close as they were before, wider. What analysis do you do? What thinking do you do on what's the appropriate width of a sidewalk?
Yeah, it depends slightly on the neighborhood. The one I mentioned at St. Clair, actually, for various reasons with street widening and the streetcar tracks being added, the sidewalk ended up being 4 feet wide and right against the building. And nobody wanted to walk on that side of the street. They would all cross. They'd walk on the north side, just because it was more comfortable and safer. So you got to get it right. And in a really key intersection or a key part of the city, 20 feet is great. People can cross, people can stand and wait for the traffic lights and so on. In other locations, it can be less.
20 feet. So you're going from 4 feet to 20 feet. That's a
Yeah,
pretty big increase.
yeah, and it's needed. If you sit on that intersection, currently before the project started, you'll see people having to go in the street or into traffic basically to get past each other, and that's no good at all. So you want 10 feet comfortable for people to pass, two pairs of people to pass, and then we've added more to that so that we can add in street furniture, so we can have the doors to the retail swing out without the danger of them hitting people who are walking past. So you need space to do that, and the more space you can give, the more comfortable it is. But we're also removing some other, really weird trends. Honestly, I did a project a number of years ago, up at Young and Shepherd, and the Shepherd Center, as it was called then, had these huge, what we called the moat, had these huge pits that they created in the 60s that separated the sidewalk physically from the building. So you had, 10, 15 feet of sidewalk, a 20-foot pit in the ground, and then the building. And it was supposed to be this kind of utopian idea that you could go down into these moats and there was retail down there. What it did in effect was separate people from the engaging part of the building, from the retail, and it was a mall, so it needed people there. It physically separated them, and the retail started to die. So if you look at that project now, all of those moats have been filled in. That space has been taken up with terraces for restaurants and so on, and it's a lot more successful. So it's not really always just about the sidewalk. It's about what barriers are there, what uses are there, and how you get people to engage with what's happening. You don't want your sidewalk to be just somewhere that you walk along and to pass through. You want it to be somewhere that's interesting, and that's key to the vibrancy of our downtowns.
Tell me about height and how you, as an architect, think about height. I had Joe Barrage from Urban Strategies on my show, and he was telling me, look at Yonge Street, Brian, and there's height on Yonge Street, but even there, it's mostly right around the subway stations. It doesn't go the whole way up and down the street. And then half a block away, it's back down to single family dwellings and low height. And he was encouraging greater height close to those subway stations. And I know that there's been a lot of controversy of late in regards to, should we have mid-rises? Should we have tall buildings? And how tall should they be? And then also, this issue about, whether Yonge Street should be the highest and then it should sort of cascade down. But then I hear that there's 80 stories approved at the Mirvish building. So tell me about height.
Height's an interesting one to me, because people get really upset about it. They get upset about it in planning meetings and community meetings. But really, if it's 80 stories or it's 75 stories from the ground, no one can tell. So to me, height is about how many people you can get there, whether you have enough transit and infrastructure to support those people. But it's become the hot button topic that I don't think it really deserves to be. What we should be thinking about is the bit that you experience. It's what does that building, how does that building hit the ground? What's in that building? Do we have the infrastructure and the transit to support the 80 stories of people that are living there? I feel the same way about when we talk about where the peak of the tent is, or whatever word they describe it as in Toronto this week. Does it need to be on Yonge Street? Well, sure, that's a good place for a height peak because there's a lot of infrastructure there. But there's no reason why we can't have secondary height peaks as we go out of the city. I think what's important to us is to create neighborhoods that have an identity. So if Yonge Street or downtown's identity is high density, a lot of people, a lot of hustle and bustle, then we can have more than one of those. But we also need some mid-rise neighborhoods too that are a bit calmer, that are a bit more about local businesses, local retailers. And then we need some single family home, super low rise neighborhoods too. People like to have options, and I think what makes a city interesting is to be able to walk from a high density neighborhood to a mid-rise neighborhood and see that change and feel that change. And we're not quite there in Toronto yet. If you think of New York, you can probably name 20 districts in New York or 20 neighborhoods that have a different feel. In downtown Toronto, we have some, but I don't think we keep naming them. I don't think people care. I don't think those names necessarily catch on. We've had the Fashion District or what's happening with King West, but they don't have the right feel yet. They haven't built that neighborhood feel. And I think we need to get there, and that comes with variation. It comes with some towers, some really tall towers, some mid-rise clustered together to get a different type of look, a different type of business, and a different type of people there too. But people need that small neighborhood to feel connected to where they live.
It seems in Toronto that there are a couple of different areas, particularly of late, that have been proposed for some height. The what I think it's called the six corners or five corners in Etobicoke, Islington, Kipling, and Bloor. You've got the Humber Bay Shores development down at the bottom, south of the old Mr. Christie factory. You've got the Golden Mile out in Scarborough. Is that a new trend, a good trend, a bad trend? What do you think?
I actually think it's a really good trend. A lot of those new developments that are happening are really interesting. And I think what we need to understand is that they're not going to be a standalone thing. We've got, 5 or 6 of them, big ones in and around the city that are happening. They should be the catalyst. We shouldn't think of that as great, we've achieved this thing, we've built this development, and that's it. When those are done, they should be the first phase of something that then becomes a neighborhood, that becomes a small town, and potentially grows into a city over the next 10 years as we add more population to Ontario generally. I don't want people to feel like completionist about it. I want them to feel like this is an exciting start to the process of creating new urban areas for people.
Well, I mentioned Joe Barrage earlier. He was interesting. He told me that within the next 10 years, Toronto could be the 3rd largest city in North America. If you think about the sort of the greater metropolitan area that would go from sort of Oshawa to Hamilton, and then we've got to start thinking about it in those terms. And we can't, if we think about it in those terms, think about everyone being at Yonge and Bay and King and Yonge and Front or right around Union Station. It's got to be spread out, and it's got to have better transit. Yeah. And to think that we actually could be bigger than Chicago and rivaling. Maybe not New York, but Los Angeles for a number of people. That's pretty scary and exciting at the same time.
It is. It's, we keep seeing the numbers from federal government of 500,000 new immigrants or however many it is by 1.5 million by 2025. 500,000 people is 1,000 condo towers, or even more. And
1,000 condo towers.
I think it's actually more. I did the math the wrong way around. It's about 1,000 people per condo, so it's 5,000 condo towers. They're not going to go at, Yonge and King. It's just impossible.
Yeah,
we can't just keep assuming that you're going to put more and more people into a dense urban areas. We've got to start creating a spread, but not a sprawl. And I think that's an important definition. A sprawl is just exactly. It's a sprawl is uncontrolled. It's just moving out and in ever lower density. A spread would be creating those new nodes that you talked about a few minutes ago. Creating those new nodes and allowing them to grow into little centers, and we have to manage it like that. You mentioned LA. LA is a sprawl. It's a mess of traffic jams and low rise. New York isn't. New York has its boroughs. It's Manhattan, Brooklyn is now growing massively. For example, as well, Queens is growing massively too. But they've created those nodes of development, and we need to be very, very careful to do the same.
We're chatting today with Stephen Paynter. He's a principal at Gensler Architects. We're chatting about Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area and urban development and architecture. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Stephen in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Stephen Paynter. He is a principal architect at Gensler Architects in Toronto. Stephen, I got to ask you, you obviously grew up in Great Britain. You went to Liverpool, etc. Why'd you come to Toronto?
That's a great question. I grew up actually just outside of London. It was a very expensive and not particularly friendly place to grow up. As commuter towns around really big cities can be. And then went to school in Newcastle, which is about as far north as you can go without going into Scotland. For those of you who don't know the UK too well, I went to school there, worked there for 6 or 7 years, mostly designing schools, universities, hospitals, that kind of public funded, public infrastructure type work. And it was great. The intention was to replace every single school in the UK over the course of about 10 years. We then had, to put it nicely, a change of government. And I'm sure even most Canadians have heard of this idea that the government came up with in 2010 called austerity. And it was about as fun as it sounds. Public funded work dried up, infrastructure projects dried up, downtown started to die because there was no money to be spent. So it seemed like a good time to leave. I was still pretty early in my career, but there wasn't work. The company I was at actually went from about 150 people at its peak to about 35 people when I left, and it just wasn't an enjoyable place to be. So I looked around the world. I looked at the US, Australia, Canada, and a few other places, and landed on Toronto because there was so much opportunity, so much mix of culture, and a really strong architecture and design and construction community here that was positive and was looking forward into the future. So came out here, did some job interviews, and got a position at Quadrangle and moved here 2 weeks later. But it was a quick process in the way that you do when you're in your 20s. Yeah.
That's decisive. Well, I think Toronto and Canada's benefited from that decision. Thank you for that. You talked about it being expensive in around London. Last year was the first year in I think recorded history, frankly, that there was out-migration from Ontario and particularly Toronto as people moved to Quebec and Alberta. And there's article after article about it becoming unaffordable to live in Toronto. You were on a Board of Trade affordability task force, I understand. Tell me, what do you think the solution is to our affordability issue in Toronto?
It is really challenging. We're not a particularly affordable city, but we're nowhere near the kind of disparity that was happening, especially in London when I was there. To kind of show how bad it was, I think London is a very expensive city to live in, most of the UK as well. The money I made as an architect when I worked in Newcastle was less than minimum wage in Ontario. So I was a fully qualified, fully licensed architect making less than Ontario minimum wage. So yes, things are expensive here, but salaries have gone up and are trying to keep pace with what we're doing. That said, we want to make sure that our problem here doesn't get worse, that doesn't get to the point where it really is impossible. So I think that there's a few big things we need to do on that. We need to really continue to encourage small businesses and to develop here, not just huge international tech companies, but small businesses that are going to be here, that are going to grow, and they're going to add well-paid jobs, and that's obviously important. And then we need to make sure we have a variation of housing as well. We need, when we look at these new developments, to look at affordable units, be that due to their location or the level of finish, or because of their size. And we need to make sure that they are mixed in. The other thing that really helps, honestly, is just quantity. If you can get enough new buildings and enough new projects into the market, into the residential market especially, you do reduce the overall cost. Less scarcity means less demand. Yeah, exactly. So that's key too, and getting that a really good hit of those projects very quickly will be helpful. And then we need to make sure that other things don't start to get expensive. You look at London as an example, because I know it well, commuting into the city is incredibly expensive. So that transit cost, drives up the unaffordability. I think, last time I was there for any great length of time, I think an annual train ticket was £3,000, which is $5,500 just to get, 3 or 4 stops into the city. It's crazy. Back then that was nearly half of my, a third of my salary. That's impossible. You spend half your salary on rent, a third of it on transit, the rest of it on tax. You suddenly can't eat anymore. So we need to make sure that while we try and solve the housing crisis, we don't create other problems with increased cost of living for infrastructure, for transit, for all those other pieces that people actually really need, and food security, of course, as well, making sure people can get good quality food at a right price. So it's a real mix, and it's difficult to, as an architect and designer, I can target the rental piece, the cost of living piece in that direction. But we need a lot of other people to come together to start working on and ensuring the other problems don't get worse.
The Ontario government had an affordability task force last spring, and one of the recommendations was to have an as-it-right ability to convert a single-family home into 4 different dwelling units. You said, I think, in the Rossesvalles area. When I used to live in that area, a lot of those homes were like that. They were duplexes, they were triplexes, they were rooming houses, they were, other types of structures. And then, the density was higher. When you think about the density in Mississauga, in a lot of suburbs, it's about, 4 or 6 units per acre. I think that, Lower West Village, Rossesvalles, Beaches, etc., is like 20 units per acre, or even maybe more. What do you think of that idea of giving people the right to dramatically increase the density in their own house without having to go and get separate zoning approval for it?
Good question. It's a thing that I kind of love and hate at the same time. If you increasing the density by dividing up homes is great. It's great for housing costs. It's great for bringing people out to these neighborhoods and supporting the businesses that are here. But if you take a $1 million home and make it into 4 apartments, suddenly it's probably worth 2.5 million. So it then becomes impossible for people to buy. They can rent, they can buy a part of a house, but they can't, the overall cost of the house goes up. We actually faced a very similar problem in the UK for a different reason. They added a rule in that say you could expand your home by up to 10% without getting any approvals. And then your home was 10% bigger, and then a year later you could expand it again and make it 10% bigger. What that led to was every house being huge, and there was no starter homes left. There was no house that you could go out and buy as a new couple or a young professional that wasn't 5 bedrooms. Like, it was just impossible. So we want to make sure that we don't fall into that trap. If we're going to start dividing houses up, we're going to start adding more people to them. We do need to also be building new starter homes as well, to make sure that we're capturing that house for less than $1 million market, rather than just making the existing buildings that are here more and more expensive.
How do you do that? Open up the green belt?
Well, no, then you end up with a bunch of places that people don't really want to live because they're not pleasant. The part of it is building non-single family residences, making sure our condo market remains affordable. And part of it is taking up vacant lots and laneway homes and that kind of thing. And there's been a push for and against laneway homes, for example, but there's a huge opportunity to do that. You can create a small 800 square foot home on the laneway where people's garages are at the back of their houses, and effectively double the number of streets.
I used to live in Vancouver, and you see those laneway homes everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And they are generally smaller. They're generally 2-bedroom or 1-bedroom right onto the street. Great opportunity to do that here, I think. Adds density, but also creates that kind of small piece of real estate that people can afford.
I interviewed a guy who wrote a book called The Missing Middle. And he said that the problem is city zoning that allows you to build big condos or single family homes, but discourages missing middle. And he said, but the missing middle is where the vast majority of people actually really want to live.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're finding that with mid-rise buildings as well. Mid-rise buildings are great for the missing middle, as it were, but they're very challenging to make economically. If you look at how much you have to pay for a site, and a good site, then you have to take down what's there and try and build back. There's a kind of break-even point at 6, 8 stories, and if you want to start making money, you have to start going taller. So mid-rise then becomes very difficult to develop for people. You need you need to add density to make money, and at the moment with interest rates going up, you need to add more density. So those missing middles, those laneway homes, those mid-rises are very challenging for people to take the risk on. Do you want to risk 15-20 million dollars to create a mid-rise, knowing that you might not make your money back? Probably not.
You were head of sustainability resilience practice. Tell me about what that was all about.
Yeah, so Genza is one of the only architecture firms that are always at the COP meetings, the global resilience and sustainability meetings, and our CEO Diane Hoskins actually signed up to the Paris Agreement and all of the subsequent agreements. So as a firm, we're dedicated to being net zero by 2030, which is a huge challenge that we're on our way towards. But as the sustainability and resilience leader, it was really helping to implement that. How do we make sure our clients are aware of it and educated and striving to do it? How do we make sure that the buildings we design are sustainable, resilient, low energy, low impact as well? And how do we develop systems to do that mean that we can convince our clients and convince them that it's going to be good value too? And so as an example, over the last 4 or 5 years, I've been working on an approach to doing all mass timber buildings that cost less than a standard steel or concrete building. And that's, was nearly impossible for a long time. Mass timber was special, it was expensive. We're actually at the point now where I can say to you, I'll build you a 3-story office in timber that will be net zero and be able to do that cheaper than a standard construction, because we've got the spans right, we've got the material efficiency right, we've got the construction timeline down, we've got the prefabrication working, and we can do it. So that's been our commitment, to start to figure out how to do those things and deliver them to our clients, and therefore deliver them to our neighborhoods without additional cost, but with a huge amount of benefit as well.
How high can you go with a mass timber?
Oh, good question. The tallest one right now in Milwaukee, the Ascent Tower is 22 floors. Brock Commons at UBC is 18 floors, fully protected. We've designed, as part of the work we've been doing for some time, we designed a 35-story building, fully engineered and ready to go. It starts to get very complicated and very weird above about 20, which is why you see that the building in Oslo, Norway, which is 20 stories as well. I think we'll see a lot of buildings getting up to that height, and then we'll see some really special ones going higher. But you have to start doing some pretty interesting engineering to go taller than that, and that's really down to the weight. The lighter the building is, and the more timber you use in it, actually the more it moves around. So you start to see issues with wind. You start to see issues with, especially in seismic zones as well. So then, how do we make that building stand up and not sway around in the wind? Yeah, well, stay standing is fine, but this is a very specific example. The first time we did the design for the 35-story one, we did a wind tunnel test on it, and the top of the building moved about 3 meters relative to the base. So it didn't fall down, and it was, structurally it was safe, but you'd probably get a little seasick in that top floor. So we worked on it for another 6 or 8 months after that, re-engineered it, stiffened it up, as they say in engineering terms, and got it to the point where it reacted the same as a steel building. But all of that's groundbreaking stuff right now, right? No one's done it, no one knows how to do it, and you have to really push and think outside the box to make it work.
I was surprised in a meeting that I was in a little while ago. Someone told me that cement is incredibly carbon intensive and is one of the biggest contributors to the building industry's negative contribution to climate change. Is that true?
Yeah, it might have been me that told you. It's cement currently contributes about 8% of all greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions around the world. The entire airline industry is 2%. So it's kind of this forgotten or untalked about problem that is 4 times worse than the entire aviation industry. So as architects and designers, that's something we're really trying to tackle. Can we use less cement? Can we use low carbon cement? And there's some developments in that direction as well. Can we replace cement with other byproducts, fly ash replacement as an example? But really driving down the amount of it we use so that it is only where it's needed. So for example, in the timber buildings we're doing, of course, we have concrete below ground to do the foundations or the parking, but then we're trying to go all timber above that. And you'll even see people, a lot of the kind of leading sustainable and technology companies are saying they're going to do dry buildings above ground. What that means is no concrete, no cement, no hot welding of steel above ground at all. So really trying to remove it from as much as we do as possible.
We're chatting tonight with Stephen Paynter. He is a principal at Gensler Architects. We're talking about building cities and building greater cities, better cities. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments. I'm going to ask Stephen what his vision is for Toronto in the future. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. My guest is Stephen Paynter. He's a principal at Gensler Architects in Toronto. We've been talking about building a better Toronto, building a better city, urban form, residential, office, etc. Stephen, I got to ask you, if you were premier or minister of municipal affairs or mayor or something like that of Toronto, tell us what your vision for Toronto, the greater Toronto area, would be in the next decade or so. What would you do to change what we're building, to build a better city for us?
Well, firstly, that is not a job that I would ever wish on myself or anyone else, to be quite honest. We have so many challenges, I think, for the city and surrounding area, but we also have a huge amount of opportunity as well. And I mentioned before that I moved here because there was so much opportunity and because it was so culturally interesting. And I think our vision should continue to be to grow in that way, to bring people in, to bring the best people in from around the world and see what they can achieve. We need that diversity of intelligence, diversity of approaches to make it happen. More specifically, I'd really like to see some of our neighborhoods start to become more distinct, more interesting. I'd like to see some of our smaller businesses start to really thrive in the downtown as well. And I'd like Toronto to have a truly kind of Canadian feel to it. I think that's been our main attractor for people. And I don't want to see us lose that. I think Vancouver has this kind of very interesting, very Canadiana kind of look and feel to it, and the businesses that are there. We could do with more of that in Toronto. I think this idea that we're a global city is important, but we shouldn't lose that thing that makes us special, that makes us interesting.
How do you make us special, distinct?
Well, where Toronto is right now, and I think where it's going towards is really those kind of interesting little cultural neighborhoods. And we're starting to see that go away a little bit, I think, unfortunately. As I said, I live in Roncesvalles. It's traditionally the Polish neighborhood. But the number of Polish businesses here is reducing as people kind of age out and it becomes more mixed. I think we need that. I think we need that kind of identity, not just as a city, but in individual locations as well. Where do you go for the best, whatever food, as Blogtio would put it. Parkdale is a great example. I live just on the edge of Parkdale. Better neighborhood, amazing food, really interesting culture there. Roncesvalles too. But we need to grow that. We need to make sure that as the city becomes more spread out, more diverse, bigger with more people, that it doesn't lose that heart that's made it a place that people want to be.
So
those good neighborhoods.
the city is spiky, just like the world is spiky, and those different spikes should be distinct. We all should be
Absolutely.
homogeneous and the same.
Yeah, I want to, I walk into the office every day. It's about 3 kilometers or something like that. I want to walk that walk and see different neighborhoods as I go. Otherwise, it's just a boring, homogeneous city. We want to keep away from that. There's a lot of cities like that around the US, particularly. Let's not do that. Let's keep it interesting. Let's keep it spiky, and I think therefore keep it as a place that people really want to live and work.
Stephen Paynter, Gensler, thank you very much. Really appreciate your inspirational discussion of city building.
Thank you very much.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every night, 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from the Roncesvalles area, www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.